To work on this project, I've basically been assisting curatorially the lead curator, who is Letizia Treves. She's the curator of Baroque, Spanish, Italian, and French painting here. I exclusively work on Spanish painting, and it's been very exciting because this project has been thought of for a while, because our key painting, which is the St. Michael that I will show here, here to the left, has been in our collection since 1997. So we were thinking that it would be marvelous to glorify one of the most important Spanish masters of the 15th century. He's actually the most notable one and the most technically advanced of his milieu. He's also quite interesting because there are very few paintings attributed to him. There are less than 20 attributed to Bermejo. So that's why we're so fortunate to have seven of them. And actually, several of them haven't traveled outside of Spain until this precise moment. And what sparked the whole idea of having this exhibition was the restoration of precisely that St. Michael. So you can see it, if you've seen it before, perhaps in the Sainsbury wing where we have our medieval paintings, you can see it in all its glory now, because 2 years ago they decided to restore it because a lot of the gilding, the gold at the top had been lost, many of the details were worn, it was quite brown with varnish. So one of the conservators here and the whole team working with them, both conservators and scientists, have worked to restore it to its previous glory. And that's when we decided, because this has been treated and everything, we wanted to travel. So that's how the whole exhibition idea started. This painting traveled to the Prado Museum, where it was in an exhibition that took place this past winter. And there it was a major exhibition on Bermejo actually, and there were about 58 paintings. I told you there are less than 20, but there were a lot of paintings done with the workshop or only the workshop. So that's why they had such a large corpus, and they also had a lot of comparative objects. So they had textiles, they had ceramics, to really look into the details that Bermejo includes in his paintings. That's why I really encourage you to go in person to see them, because some of them are really not visible in small reproductions. So initially, it went to the Prado Museum, and then these paintings traveled to the Menac Museum in Barcelona, and finally a reduced version of 7 paintings came over here. And we are very lucky because we have 2 of the paintings are signed, so we know 100% that it was him, and another one has an inscription on the frame saying that's Bermejo. And the other 4 are smaller format, not as technically advanced, but are very funny, and they take out many features are repeated throughout these 7 paintings. So before I go into depth about Bermejo's life and who he was, I would like to explain what was the Iberian Peninsula around that time, because it's difficult to really think about what it was, because it's not as we think of Spain nowadays. Spain was actually divided in crowns and kingdoms. So for example, we have the crown of Castile. Bermejo was born in Córdoba. And then we have the crown of Aragon, where he worked most of his career. And this is interesting because these crowns were, if you were from the crown of Castile, you were as foreign as if you came from France. Essentially, imagine how it was divided at the time. Obviously, they had the language and many things that coincided in comparison to other regions. But what is interesting is that they had their own ruler, and it wasn't only until the late 15th century that the 2 crowns started uniting with the Catholic kings. So imagine them, so you would have imagined Bermejo being a foreigner working in the crown of Aragon. Why would he have gone to work in Valencia, for example, which is the place where he first resided, no? Well, we think Valencia was a very powerful city. Most of us know, for example, about Barcelona. in the 15th. Nowadays we think of Barcelona as a mecca for artists, even in the medieval period, and it was actually, until more or less the mid-15th century. Then a dramatic shift happened, especially because there was a civil war. They were fighting against the King of Aragon at the time, and also there was a peasants' revolt. There was a deep economic crisis in Barcelona, and many artists and merchants went to Valencia, actually. And it was a very prosperous city, not only because of that, but there were also popes that came from Valencia that were ruling at the time. These were the Borgia popes. And they brought a lot of many humanist artists from Italy over to Spain. So there was this incredible humanistic flourish around the time. So imagine how this attracted Bermejo to the port city that was Valencia. And you would also see many artists that were foreigners, for example, from the Netherlands, from Italy, that were active over there. So you had a very active artistic hub. So before, when he was in Valencia, he actually painted for a little town called Tos, where the St. Michael I showed you was originally at. It's a very small town, actually. But there was a very important knight over there called Antoni Joan, which I will talk about more a bit later. And then from Tos and Valencia, he went over to Daroca and Zaragoza. These were more inland cities. There wasn't as much exposure to Netherlandish art, Italian art. It was much more insular. So it was a very strong Spanish presence, let's say. There wasn't as much exchange, so that's probably why Bermejo was so appealing. He was taking the Italian, the Netherlandish styles and introducing them to these more insular cities, no? And he was very much in demand, and he probably was the most refined artist of his time in this town and the city. And then he went over to Barcelona at the end of the 15th century, actually, because in Barcelona they started recuperating from the economic crisis and everything, and they started again having quite a lot of power, and there were more constructions, especially in the cathedral and other churches around Barcelona, so there was much more demand around the time. So this is why Bermejo was so itinerant. But I will explain another reason later on. But first of all, I want to emphasize the fact that he was from Córdoba. We are not 100% sure because there's no documentary reference, but we do have this inscription on the frame of his last work. And we know that it's from the period because it's tooled and it kind of matches the calligraphy of other inscriptions of the time. And around this time, if Bermejo did indeed train in Córdoba, he would have been exposed to artists like Pedro de Córdoba. If you look at him, his style is very much Netherlandish. If you think of artists like John Van Eyck, etc., he kind of reminisces these artists, but it's a bit more primitive, isn't as advanced, let's say, in the perspective. Everything is a bit squashed. We have these minute donor figures at the bottom. So look at the jump from here to there. I mean, it's splendid how we got there. And many people actually think that he went to the Netherlands, perhaps, and that's where he saw old masters. But that wasn't necessarily, it wasn't truly necessary because there was a wide circulation of Netherlandish paintings around Spain, and many merchants and artists coming. So there were many exchanges around that time. So this is what I was saying about Netherlandish art and its influx. For example, in Zaragoza, the town I showed a bit further inland, in the cathedral, if you go, you'll see a marvelous series of Flemish tapestries, mostly dating from the 15th and 16th century, that were there when he was traveling, he was working in Zaragoza Cathedral because he worked there on several commissions. So he would have been exposed to that. Also later on, you would have the Catholic kings who collected in the late 15th century, especially Netherlandish masters. For example, if you go to Granada, in the south of Spain, I encourage you to go to the Royal Chapel, where they have incredible Netherlandish works by Hans Memling, their Bouts, etc. This one is anonymous, but I like the fact it's another St. Michael, like the one at the National Gallery. And before the Catholic kings even, there was this monarch called Alphonse V, who sent one of his court artists to the Netherlands to work in several Netherlandish workshops in Brussels. So there was this very active exchange at the time with both artists traveling from Spain to the Netherlands, artworks coming into Spain. You would mostly get them coming in from northern Spain. There was an art fair in a place called Medina del Campo, which is quite further inland, and from there they distributed these artworks all across Spain. So they came mostly from the north, which is well connected with the Netherlands, no, instead of the Mediterranean in this instance. And then there was another influence that I mentioned, Italian art. Italian art, too, is not that strong, not that present in Bermejo's work. It is in certain aspects, but I must say that there was a great influx, and especially around the time Bermejo was there, as I mentioned, the Borgia popes brought Italian artists to work in Valencia. This is an incredible recent discovery. It was just uncovered over a decade ago. This was covered actually by Baroque vaulting like panels, and you couldn't see any of the frescoes underneath. These frescoes of musical angels are above the high altar of Valencia Cathedral, and they were conceived as a much larger plan. This is the only thing that remains, and they're practically untouched, because with these wooden panels, there wasn't any smoke, or no one retouched them. They were almost as they were. And they were painted by two artists, Paolo de Sant'Eucadio and Francesco Pagano. Paolo came from Emilia-Romagna, and then Francesco Pagano from Naples, and they were brought by the Borgia Pope Alexander VI to paint the whole parts of the cathedral, including the high altar. And Paolo de Sant'Eucadio was an expert in figures, as we can see here. This is a painting we actually have here in our collection that you can see in the Sainsbury wing by Paolo de Sant'Eucadio. And you can see these very rounded features and these deep blues that we see with the musical angels that are evoked in this painting. And then I wanted to show actually this side panel of the Virgin of Montserrat, which you will see in the exhibition. This was drawn by Bermejo, but then painted, completed by the workshop of Rodrigo de Osona, who was an artist active in Valencia. But if you see the aspect, the figures especially are closer to these Italian figures. So I think that there was quite a big influence, but more on the future generations of artists active in Valencia, no? Like the Osona workshop that we see here. And then another thing I wanted to mention was the importance of collaborating with other artists. Why was Bermejo so itinerant? Well, one thing is that in every city he couldn't quite work. He could work only according to his resident status. So for example, in Valencia, and if you go to the exhibition, you will see in the manuscript that he was recorded as a citizen of Valencia. So in that case, he could work independently. He didn't have to rely on other artists for his wage or to paint together, etc. Whereas when he moved to Daroca and Zaragoza, for example, and painted this incredible work that's at the Prado, we unfortunately couldn't bring it because it's too fragile. You see this very complex frame especially. He collaborated with artists such as Martin Bernat, which we see over here. And if you compare the quality, you can see how refined the details are of the little figures. The gilding here, he uses very thick gold. The features are less refined. But he actually was paid by him because he was the one that had the power in the workshop in Zaragoza. Bermejo couldn't work on his own. He had to rely on local artists. And curiously with this altarpiece, he didn't finish the commission on time. They said, you have to finish this painting but by, I think it was 1475. And he didn't finish it, so he was excommunicated. But he was so good that they couldn't afford to lose him. So then this artist and another one really were begging for him to come back and finish the commission. He came back, but he never finished it. It was Martin Bernat and the others that did the side panels. It would have been on the side. There would have been 4 here, and then a series of paintings underneath. And we know 2 of the ones that were on the sides. This is one of them, actually. So we see how he was a bit of a rebel and didn't finish his work on time, and that's why we have so few paintings, because he was a very meticulous worker. He worked very slowly, actually. And then the other reason I wanted to explain of why he moved around so much is possibly because he may have come from a family of Jews, or he might have converted. He was initially a Jew and then became Christian. And we think this because his wife was actually a converted Jew. We know that because he was taken by the Inquisition for following Jewish practices. We're not sure 100%, but that's what they say. And also for forgetting the Christian creed. And he was trialed by them. So it was quite atypical for someone to marry a Jewish convert around that time if they weren't themselves Jewish converts. So that's one reason. Here we see, for example, a trial of a Jew. It would have happened to his wife, around that time. And the wife was from Daroca, which was the town next to Zaragoza, further inland. Then we have these Hebrew inscriptions. You see them around the tomb here, and you see the initials over here on this tomb. So it's interesting because this Hebrew inscription, for example, is all about the resurrection of Christ. It's actually legible. There are only some spelling mistakes, but it's quite accurate. So either Bermejo had some level of Hebrew, or, for example, his patron came from a Jewish background, and that's quite likely because he did have another patron that came from a Jewish background in Zaragoza. So his wife, the patrons were Jewish converts. He had quite a circle. So it's just intuitive that he might have been within this circle. And the other reason for him moving is that the Inquisition gradually moved upwards in Spain. It started more in the south and then moved upwards. So Valencia was one of the first cities in the crown of Aragon, as I explained, that had the Inquisition. Then it moved up to Zaragoza and then to Barcelona. So what did Bermejo do? He moved before they set the Inquisition, and he also had the protection of very powerful religious figures. Like in Barcelona, he sought the refuge of this archdeacon that was against the Inquisition, that we will see later. I know it's quite complex, but I'm trying to trace his route around Spain and why he did it. So then, now I want to return to his oeuvre. I'm going to look at the 7 paintings that are featured in the exhibition here. Like that, you can go back to them and think about the context and the patrons and the Jewish historical background. For example, here I start with his first painting, which is the St. Michael that I explained before, that entered our collection in 1997. This painting was done for this parish church of St. Michael in the village of Tous outside Valencia. And this parish, it was probably there until the late 19th century. And this is what the church looked like then. Unfortunately, and then it was sold off. And some decades later, that's what happened to the church. So it's quite good that it moved along, because they created this reservoir, and that's the only thing that remains, the bell tower of the church, as you can see. But they moved the facade, if you want to see this facade, to the modern town that they created next to the reservoir, if you want to visit the place. So we don't have photos of the interior, so we don't know what it looked like inside before it was sold. It probably went through several hands, but it was essentially in the United Kingdom in the early 20th century when it was acquired by a man called Jules Werner. He was a South African diamond merchant, and he had a house called Sutton Hoo, where this hung alongside other medieval paintings. He was quite a eclectic collector. And it wasn't until 1997 that they sold part of his collection, and then that's how the National Gallery acquired the painting. And it's really the highlight of our 15th century Spanish paintings here. And what we could discover, even though we didn't know where exactly it was, we probably think it was part of the high altar, since this church was dedicated to St. Michael, and it probably didn't only consist of this, but also side panels, and also more panels underneath, and possibly a scene of the Passion of Christ on top. This is quite typical of the time, to have the judgment and then redemption, like Christ redeeming you on top. But there have been many hypotheses, because we don't know what goes along it, actually. We don't know nowadays. But we do have this document where it cites clearly the date where it was painting is 1468, and it's the first payment for this painting. And this is where we discover that Bermejo was indeed a citizen in Valencia. That's how he signs his name, and his first signature alongside his signature here in the painting. So this was signed by him, but also with for Antoni Joan, who was the patron of this painting and is kneeling down here. He was the knight, a very important knight in the region of Tours. He worked with the Aragonese king, for example. I think, no, I didn't get more details. So essentially, he worked alongside the Aragonese king. He reconquered Perpignan for the crown of Aragon. He had quite a lot of power in the ports going into Valencia. His family was related to the Knight of Tirant-lo Blanc, which was an epic Valencian medieval novel, if you're interested in reading about the period. And as we can see here, he's very well, he has these golden chains, he has this damask kind of clothing, he has the sword to indicate that he's a knight, and he's reading a book which is actually clearly legible, the inscriptions within. There are two psalms combined, and they're penitentiary psalms that he would have sung to St. Michael to act as his intercessor when he's judged in the Last Judgment. No? So it's incredible how he does everything, even the stitching here on the binding of the book, very detailed. Then we have Bartolomé Bermejo here, his signature. What is Bermejo? Bermejo is like vermilion, red. And they call him Bermejo because they thought he was a red-haired and possibly connected to his Jewish origin, because around the time they represented many Jews with red hair in a way. So then that could be the connections there, but it was his nickname, let's say, Bermejo. And curiously, if we went to the Prado show, it was all red, like this, coining at his name, but I don't know, I wasn't too convinced of how it worked with the paintings, but it was quite funny to see it that color. And then you have the armor, which is splendid. Everything works, everything, the hinges, everything. You can actually, he probably was looking at the real armor, because everything except this works. You see that there's that pointy bit jutting out? Then he couldn't have folded his foot. So that's the only bit where it doesn't quite work. But he was very keen on his pearls, as you can see, and his precious stones. And then this was gilt in gold, which was very, very expensive, fire gilt. So it was a very laborious process, and only kings could have armor like this. And curiously here you even have this image of these towers, which is a representation of the heavenly Jerusalem. That's what you aspire to with Saint Michael, who has the control of those that go to heaven or hell, no? And normally you see him holding some scales, but here he appears with a sword. For example, here are other representations of Saint Michael. Here we have Joan Reixach, who was a contemporary artist active in Valencia, and we see more of the fury of Saint Michael as he goes with that spear and tries to attack the dragon underneath. You see it's as fantastical as the one from the National Gallery. It was quite a hybrid creature. Then we have the more typical representation with the scales, with the damned and the saved, in this painting by Hans Memling, so he probably looked as well at Flemish examples. And then we have this fantastical weather vane, actually. It's a kind of bit less than life-size weather vane that was moving with the wind on top of the Brussels Town Hall. You can see it actually in the museum of the City Museum in Brussels. And this was probably based on some design by Roger van der Weyden, who was another artist active in the Netherlands. So you can see how St. Michael and the armor was present. All these very similar types were present in Spain and in the Netherlands in this fluid exchange that happened. And I forgot to talk about the devil, which is my favorite aspect actually. You see here, he's quite stunning with his kind of fiery eyes, and then he has another face here that are like nipples eyes, I'm not quite sure. And then you have the metallic kind of arms, and then you have snakes biting the arms and a snake coming out through here. And then you have this moth-like wings. They say that there was a plague of moths around that period or something like that, so maybe they considered them kind of devilish creatures. And then you have this face, this kind of like an anglerfish, or it reminds me of Cheshire's cat from Alice in Wonderland. You can fantasize, but you probably got it from a motto book and just created a hybrid creature like the creatures we see in Bosch, if you've seen any of his paintings. And then there are interesting plants that are represented here. Well, we have some details, but it's not very visible. But here there's a poppy that symbolizes death, and it's right next to the devil. And for example, here is not quite visible, but there's a mint that's next to him. So you have these herbs that cure you, or you have thistles and other evil plants around the devil. So you have them strategically placed around the painting. And then you have the fantastic kind of gilding and all the patterns that you should look at up close in the exhibition. And this is to explain how the process was. If we can draw a line here, these, for example, this is what it looked like in the top. The gold had gone, the gold leaf was practically gone in this strip up here. It was very brown. There were areas that were repainted. So that's what it looked like back before 2017, which is when the restoration started around like that. This is when they covered all the losses and repainted them. These were all the areas that were lost. So our conservator had to work very meticulously to reconstruct all the plants in the passages that were lost, and also the gold, the gilding that we see up here. No? And then what happened? Before it was restored, there was a copy done for this collector in Cordoba. He said, "Oh, I want to have my own Bermejo at home." So he started with Saint Michael, and here we have the copy. And then they took it even further, and they forged it and created a hybrid Saint George. They just changed the devil for a dragon, and here we go. We have a Saint George. And then he put a donor here that looks like a self-portrait by Van Eyck. So he did a true pastiche here. And it was I think it was a painter from Belgium who did all this. And he fooled the French public for a bit when he did that. but not too long. So then moving on, none of you remember the St. Michael's face. It looks quite a lot like the Virgin, right? There are some similarities. This is something new that we've discovered between the Prado and the Menarche exhibitions and this one. We dated much earlier because we think that stylistically it's much closer to the St. Michael actually. And this Virgin of Montserrat is very important in Catalonia, northern Spain, because there's a whole monastery and pilgrimage site there. This is, and she's related to the Saw, because Serrat, Sierra, is Saw, and that's in Spanish, Sierra is Saw, Montserrat. And it's very weird because it's the first time I see her sitting on a saw. Like, this is something, if any of you have seen her sitting on a saw, I'm quite curious to hear about it. Because normally, for example, here, I don't know if you see the angels, they're sawing the mountain. That's more typical, because the landscape around around Montserrat is very ragged, like this, like teeth, sharp teeth. And then here, well, you don't get the attribute, but you get the similar landscape. And also, what is interesting, here you have a dark kind of Madonna, right? And in Bermejo, we have this pearly white Madonna. If you go to see the sculpture of this Virgin in its current sanctuary nowadays, you'll see that it's blackened, but because the varnish and the fumes and everything, it has darkened over time. And that's why in that Baroque painting done in the 17th century, she's much darker, no? But there's this tradition that we continue perpetuating that she was always painted dark, but that's not true. There were different periods, no? And the other thing is this painting, she was very important for merchants, this Virgin. She actually guaranteed that they had safe trips in the Mediterranean, and they were safe when encountering tempests, etc. So many merchants went to pray to her before going on their trips. So that's exactly what Francesco de la Chiesa, who was a merchant from Alessandria in the north of Italy, did before going back to Italy. So he went and he stopped to pray to her and then went off to Italy. And we know his profession. You see this boat here in the background, so you can see that connection, the mercantile connection there. And Francesco de la Chiesa was actually from a town called Aquiterme in Alessandria, as I mentioned, and he commissioned this piece around 1470 to 75, and he was quite keen to have the Virgin here on the saw, but also the monastery, and then these side wings. And here we have his namesake Saint Francis, Francesco Francis, no? And then here we have Saint Julian, who is the namesake of his brother, who's called Giuliano de la Chiesa. So it was very much a family enterprise, and this ended up back in his hometown, where his brother and other family members would pay for a chapel for this painting. So this was produced in Valencia, and then it was sent to northern Italy. And then that's where it still stays. So it's been there for over 500 years now. And this is quite a special occasion because it has traveled for the first time to Spain and the United Kingdom in 500 years. It hasn't left the Cathedral of Aquiterme where it currently is. And it's impeccable. There's nothing. There's just, if you go there, there's like a candle that has burned his shoulder here. You see, that's the only mark. There are small losses here and there, but it's in prime condition. And then we have the birth of the Virgin, and then the circumcision up here. And this, as you can see, their wings, they close right. So at the back we have the Annunciation with Gabriel and Mary. No? We couldn't show this in the exhibition, unfortunately, because the room we show the paintings in is quite small. So we have a small reproduction of it. But it's normally like that. It's shot in the cathedral. They only open it on special occasions. So you're quite lucky to see the inside in that sense. So these wings and the sides, as I previously explained, were just drawn by Bermejo but completed by the Rodrigo de Osona workshop, which was a workshop active in Valencia. Again, Bermejo didn't finish the work, like we saw in Santo Domingo de Silos. We don't know why exactly, but the wings were completed by this workshop. So again, we see this active collaboration between the artists and the local workshops. And you can also see, if you look at the details, like the plants, they're much more refined here than over here. And again, we see similar plants to the ones we saw in the St. Michael. We see the poppies. Here is more related to the Passion of Christ and the death, like the red, the blood. Then we have the goldfinch that's also related to the Passion of Christ, because apparently there was a bird, a goldfinch, that was flying, and then when Christ was being crucified, a drop of blood was smeared on this bird, and that's why it has a red chest, the red face, I mean. So that's why, and then the thread is like the thread of life, you know? He's holding on to the bird. And then we know that the patron Francisco de la Chiesa is reading the Salve Regina in honor of the Virgin, and this is also completely legible if you go and see it. And finally, we have this very eclectic monastery, this not very homogeneous architecturally, but nowadays we see it as quite an homogeneous building because it was sacked during Napoleonic times, so it has transformed a lot over time. But yes, it's actually one of his finest works, and there is a very interesting transition between the gold backgrounds that we saw before with the St. Michael's and this beautiful landscape with the sunset that's imaginary. That's not really what the landscape in Montserrat looks like. It's closer to these ones that we saw here, actually. So he went from there to this, painting landscapes, and then he went over to these scenes that he painted, and probably in La Roca, which was next to Zaragoza, the small town I mentioned in the map that's more inland. And these scenes would have gone underneath an altar. You remember the St. Michael? They initially thought that these went underneath the St. Michael, but that hypothesis has been discredited because we don't have any documentary evidence. So here we have the 4 scenes of Christ the Redeemer, which were quite typical for the bottom of an altarpiece. And in the middle, there could have been a chalice for the Eucharist. So they could have been divided into two groups. And we can see them of different dimensions. When you go, you'll see that they're a bit, 2 are taller than the other 2. And that's because they were cut in the 19th century. The top was cut, and then they were cut in the middle, and then several pieces. So imagine, many of these were cut from the, that's why when we go to museums, we see them in many pieces, in the 19th century especially, so they could sell them separately and get more money. They would cut them in many instances. But here they have been put together quite marvelously. And we have 2 from the museum in Barcelona and 2 from a private foundation that are on loan to that museum because they were separated at the start of the 20th century. And we have these 4 scenes related to Christ, the resurrected Christ, and then the ascension of Christ. And they would have been very much interconnected with the chalice and the Eucharist and the blood of Christ and the whole Mass that would have been taking place in front of it. So I want to go into detail now about the specific scenes. Here, for example, before I go into detail, I want to talk about the possible commission of this. So we already discredited that it belonged to the St. Michael painting, but we think it may have belonged, it may have been commissioned by a Jewish patron. We think this because one of Bermejo's main patrons in La Roca in this town was a Jewish convert called Juan de Loperuelo, and we indicate this in the inscription as well. And as I indicated before, there are these Hebrew initials here, so again there is this presence throughout, but we don't know, this is just a hypothesis again. And then going into detail about each painting, for example, here we have Christ descending into limbo, and he has like Adam kissing his hand, Eve here with her hands together. Then we have David with his crown, and then this weird figure from the Old Testament called Jezebel. This has this iron rod piercing her tongue, but possibly because he betrayed or lied, I think, in the Old Testament. So it was her punishment. But then we have these firearms, this melancholic devil. This devil looks like the one of the St. Michael. There's so much going on. And then you have these other devils squashed by the doors when Christ comes to save those that are going to paradise, no? And what is fascinating is the realism. You can see every single hair painted individually, even the body hair. It wasn't that typical around the time, or showing the genitals. That's very strange. I mean, especially Christ. And then, curiously, he is the only one that's not showing them, so we think perhaps he could have been the patron. That could have been his portrait, we're not sure. It's hypothetical again, but it's interesting the contrast again he lays between the people that are being saved with their halos and those that are damned in the background, and how creative he was in creating these creatures. This one, the head is turned 360, you see them, and they're completely fantastical. He loved his devils and demons like Bosch. And then we go on, and this group of people now goes to paradise. They're here at the gates of paradise. That's paradise in there. So they're just looking at the image of Christ in the flesh, a miniature version, and praying to him on a tree that is now leafless, it's lifeless, and it's kind of, again, a message of the redemption and praying before going into paradise. And here you have St. Michael guarding the gates to paradise, no? And you have the angels that are singing, welcoming them to paradise. And you have the same characters reappearing. You have David, you have Adam and Eve. And then, in the other two, that would be on the other side of the chalice, quite probably, you have the resurrection of Christ. And here you have, for example, the Hebrew initials I mentioned. And then you have these figures that have this fantastical armor. These two are covering their eyes from the light, is blinding them, and this one is covering his ears. So you have different reactions to the thunderous noise and the light coming from Christ as he resurrects. And then, and this is kind of like the angel on a surfboard. I don't know how he stays there, but and then you have the three Marys behind, bringing the ointment jars, no? And the three Marys in this kind of composition is much more typical. Actually, you see that a lot in Flemish painting. And then you have the Ascension of Christ, the final scene, and you have all of those saved in those golden clouds. And then you have his footprints, which for me is the most interesting part. He's leaving his trace on earth, no? And then he's surrounded by Mary and the apostles around here. And it's a very interesting thing. I've never seen gilded clouds like this, and he combines these techniques quite interestingly. And then the detail, again, of the brocade is quite interesting. So you have these four, and then we don't, from this epoch, from the Daroca Zaragoza epoch, where he's working very much in collaboration, we go to his last piece, which is the Desplat Pietà. This is where he has mastered, he has reached his climax. This is his last painting. After that, he designed stained glass for Barcelona Cathedral. If you're interested, if you go to Barcelona Cathedral, you can see stained glass designed by him in the chapel of St. John the Baptist, with the baptismal font below. And this is actually also in Barcelona Cathedral. It's in the museum of Barcelona Cathedral, which is right next to the cloisters of the cathedral. And why did he go to Barcelona? Well, there was a contest to paint the organ there, and he competed, he lost, but even then he went over there, and he was protected by a very important figure who was against the Inquisition, as I mentioned before. This is Ruiz Desplat. He's the Archdeacon of Barcelona Cathedral. They probably saw his technical merit. There was no one like him. I told you there was that gap in Barcelona where there was an economic there were economic difficulties. The merchants went to Valencia. Now Barcelona was gaining pace again, and then having these commissions for the stained glass, as I mentioned. And then he decided to commission this piece, which actually moved sites and was initially destined to his house, the Archdeacon's house, which was connected by a bridge to the cathedral. The bridge is now gone, but you can still visit the Archdeacon's house nowadays. Just to give you some context, this is what it kind of looked like. These are watercolors from the 19th century, but you get an idea of his display of Roman antiquities and Renaissance reliefs. He was a great collector, an avid collector. For example, he owned this relief of his Roman emperor, Galba, by Antonio de Polaiolo. And that's why, for example, we saw that inscription. There was kind of like Roman script where it said that he was from Córdoba. Bermejo was very much in tune with these antiques that Luis Desplat owned in his house. And Luis Desplat was very much an avid promoter of art, and as we can see, he wanted to have himself portrayed as he is here with Saint Jerome, who translated the Bible from Greek to Latin. So we have him as his spiritual mentor, and with the scene of the Passion in between. And what is interesting is we have, in terms of nature, for me this is the most stunning. There are about 50 different kinds of plants, 20 different kinds of animals. The least realistic is the lion, but it's quite cute. It has like a human face on a dog's body or something like that, because you wouldn't have seen the lion. But then if you go to the exhibition, please look. I can't really have close-ups that show these details, but look at his working process. You will see parallel lines here to show the garments. Well, it's a bit visible here. And then he used a compass to create the halo. Here you can see some of the marks. And then he even used incisions. Here you can see them actually with the reflection to create the sleeves, because it was so dark that he couldn't use light black, no, to trace the lines. So really go up close and see these details, which are not visible in the photograph. And then you have, apart from Christ, which again has this very, very prominent wounds. You can even see the blood trailing this way, because it has dried on his arm, no? And then you get the cross. It is very prominent in the background with the blood falling on the robe. And then you get smaller figures. Here, for example, you have Joseph of Arimathea, who's coming to collect Christ, and then you have also the Virgin with her spindle here in front of this little house. You know, you see this figure here. And then you have a hunter with his bow and arrow here. If you go to see them, they're a bit difficult to see, but they're up here. And that whole city here is Holy Jerusalem. We saw it in the armor of Christ. Here we see it again. Then we see the damned in Babylon with all the rain pouring down. We have this funny windmill that looks like a house with wind vanes. Then we see this soldier who's guarding the tomb where he's resurrected from. So we have all these backstories happening behind the main scene. No? He's very good at narratives. And then we have all the fascinating little creatures. For example, we have these butterflies, the snails, you will see lizards, you will see caterpillars, you will see again even more plant types than what we saw in St. Michael. You can see strawberries, mints. He probably used some kind of model book, because in many of these paintings you don't see them traced underneath. There's no drawing underneath. these plans. So he used some kind of pattern book to do this. And then you have the very intricate details of the gold inscription around the veil of the Virgin and the transparent veils. And then you have the inscription I mentioned before. That's the only indication that he's from Córdoba, actually. I can go back so you can see. Again, you see? This is an inscription, that's what it says. Work of Bartolomé Bermejo of Córdoba, Cordobensis. So this is the only proof we have he's from there. And then after this, as I mentioned, he would then go on to design the stained glass in Barcelona Cathedral, and then in the Mercantile Exchange House, La Lonja, in Barcelona. And then soon later, after these commissions, which were in 1500, 1501, he would probably passed away. But he left this incredible legacy, where we see his transition from the Saint Michael in all his glory with the gold background to the very detailed nature captured here in the Pietà Pla, which I encourage you to see. Now you have a month, bring as many people as possible, promote it. These are wonders, and they probably won't travel again in 100 years, some of them, so you have the pleasure of having them right here. And I encourage you all to go, and thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure.